Quarantines are not new. Quarantines have been happening for a long, long time. Word quarantine comes from quaranta, which is the word for 40 in Italian, ironically, where there's been the greatest number of deaths now from COVID-19. So it's not a new thing. Authorities have been, putting people into isolation for a long time, but in modern times, it's become a legal challenge. And really the issue from a law enforcement perspective happens when initially, in the few examples we have of quarantines, people will abide the quarantine until when things start going too long. And then you have to be draconian like they have been in countries like China. So compliance becomes an issue over time. In fact, if you look at the curve, it's an exponential curve. So as time goes on, compliance drops. So it's a reverse exponential curve. So it goes just like that. And that leads to violative enforcement. All right. So we're going to do 3 or 4 hypos. Again, we'll do them relatively quickly, but we're going to use the same model to discuss quarantines, okay? And then I'm happy to answer questions too. All right, so what happens if you are exposed to something like the coronavirus, but you're not showing any symptoms? This is a civil rights issue, civil liberties issue?
Good question.
Can the government quarantine you? Can they prevent your movement, freedom of movement? Somebody said, good question.
Technically, they did. I mean, they did impose stay home, not the government, but the government of the state. So, yes.
So you're saying that the government could not limit your movement?
I was saying, well, they have. They're asking us to limit our movements just to avoid spread. So I'm kind of saying yes.
Okay.
Under certain circumstances. Normal, no.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody dealing with this right now? Some of you guys are probably dealing with this issue right now.
Well, I mean, it's if you have first of all, I mean, a quarantine can only be issued by a public health officer. So you're presuming a certain level of medical expertise to determine this
right.
individual or these groups of individuals pose a health risk to the public that overrides, their freedom or their interest in their freedom. So I'm presuming, I'm just saying, maybe I'm the devil's in the details, but you don't need to show symptoms to be contagious. So if you have a medical opinion that somebody is a threat and could be a carrier, a health officer can order them quarantined.
Yeah. Absolutely right. So your freedom of movement can be limited even if you don't show any symptoms. The mere exposure is sufficient for somebody, either a public health officer or even a law enforcement officer exercising some kind of prosecutorial discretion on the ground, right? If there's sufficient evidence to indicate that there's been mere exposure, and it's different standards in different municipalities, exposure can be enough to detain and limit an individual's movement. So it doesn't necessarily need to be it doesn't need to be a symptomology environment. Now, if there's no symptoms and there's no evidence to indicate that there's been exposure, that's a different story. Okay, so this is not technically a civil rights or civil liberties issue. Okay. All right, how about there's now a mass quarantine in effect, and violators will be arrested.
Yeah, and which one of us is going to volunteer to initiate that arrest?
Yeah.
Which, of course, is the big catch-22 of quarantine, is how you really enforce it without putting the enforcement arm that's keeping the peace and everything else in jeopardy themselves.
Right. But can that be enforced, Shannon? Can the mass quarantine can be enforced through arrests? What do you think?
I mean, this is what, like, every rated B, horror movie with zombies and infection is based on. I would lean on, if a health officer renders a medical opinion that is a valid threat and that mass of people is likely infected and carriers,
Right.
then you probably have legal grounds for it, the logistics of which is a nightmare.
So usually what usually the situation is it's when it comes to something like this, and I say usually because there's just so little data, is a mass quarantine is border based. Okay. So each entity, state, local, or federal, is given legal authority to limit the freedom of movement of its citizens within its respective borders. So the CDC has the authority, legal authority, under a mass quarantine, if it's in effect, which is not in effect in this country right now. By the way, stay at home is not a mass quarantine. It's stay at home. Just don't get me started on the stay at home and the shelter in place and all that stuff. There's still not a mass quarantine. Okay. But CDC has the authority, for instance, to detain, basically administratively arrest and prevent movement of somebody coming into the country. So they may do this through customs, they may do this through other federal agencies, but it's under the aegis of CDC or even FEMA. State and local governments can quarantine citizens within their risk. So local governments can quarantine smaller communities or areas of individuals that present with symptoms or have exposure, and the state can do the same. Okay. But what you're hearing in the media is not a limitation on freedom of movement, because that's a big deal, right? To put a mass quarantine into effect raises some significant legal issues, which is part of the reason why countries in the West that have more egalitarian and democratic norms have been having a harder time and will have a harder time from a civil rights lawyer's perspective. This is this is a price we pay, right? And so they'll have a harder time limiting movement because there's certain things that it's difficult for us to do. And to be honest with you, there's a cultural shift, as all of us know. There's a cultural DNA for us as Americans or people living in the Europe or other, Japan, Australia, where we don't want to be told what to do. It's difficult. Things have to get pretty bad, as you guys probably know on the ground. Okay. So what about this? I had contact with a coronavirus patient. Am I required to go into isolation?
No.
Who said that? Was that you, Shannon? I don't know who said that. Okay, so somebody said no. Anybody else? You're required to go into isolation? Self-isolate, let's say?
Well, they want you to because you don't know. I mean, but don't know. I'll say I don't know.
Self-isolation is not a legal obligation, but the state can, again, force you to be isolated. They can even go as far as to arrest you. State, federal, or local authorities, you guys, can arrest. In fact, there are laws on the books in California where there's quarantine orders that can be issued. Usually for now, I think it's mostly voluntary, but there's quarantine orders that can be issued. And violating those orders can result in civil penalties and criminal penalties. Especially in California and Florida have some of this, and Louisiana, I think, have some of the strongest quarantine laws on the books. There's additional laws that can limit if the president enacts these laws. I mean, this has never been done, but that can limit free speech in addition to freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, a number of other rights that can be limited. Now, just like there's time, place, and manner restrictions for freedom of assembly, there are time, place, and manner restrictions for quarantines. So there's no can't be an unlimited quarantine in time. It cannot be, it's very difficult to do a mass quarantine of the entire United States, very difficult to do legally. It would be challenged. Now, the reality is it can be challenged all at once, but most people are going to say, just forget your legal challenge. This is a thing. And initially, everybody's going to go along with it. The problem starts happening in quarantines as time passes. All right. What else can I tell you about this? Now, there is a right to challenge a quarantine order that has to be, under federal law at least, has to be, the hearing has to occur as soon as possible. So it has to be fast-tracked. If you're in a rocket docket, it has to be moved right up to the top. So quarantines can be challenged legally, and they have to be fast-tracked. The challenge has to be fast-tracked through the court system. All right, let's see, a few more hypos. Who can enforce quarantines? Same thing applies here. CDC can directly issue an isolate or a quarantine order. And some states can as well, but a federal government quarantine order obviously kind of beats out or cuts out all of the state and local orders. But same thing, it's border-based. Okay. Another one, what circumstances must somebody be tested for? I really should say must, not can. But must they be tested for a coronavirus? In other words, can the government force you to be tested, or does that violate a right to bodily health or bodily privacy? Any thoughts on this? Can the government force you to get tested for the coronavirus? What if you say it's against your religious beliefs?
Does this fall into the same category as like vaccinations and things like that nature?
No, it's actually higher than vaccinations. Vaccinations are different. I mean, there's been very little case law on this, but when it's something like an imminent threat, vaccinations are not considered imminent. The harm that may arise from a non-vaccinated individual, it's considered to be, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not imminent. So it's considered to be a harm that may occur later in time. But when it's imminent, the burden on the individual, the burden on the government to enforce public safety and public health is much higher. So yes, the government can force you to get tested for a coronavirus, irrespective of your right to bodily privacy, your freedom of religion, because the burden on the government outweighs your individual right to religious freedom. Okay. And again, all rights are limited, right? So this is a limitation. It's an extreme limitation. Doesn't really happen that often, but it is a limitation on your freedom of religion, let's say. On the other side, people can't demand a test for the coronavirus. There's no right to demand a test for a coronavirus. You have to obtain doctor approval. In our current situation, you have to have the test available in the first place. So it doesn't really work on the flip side as well. All right, let's do one more. What happens to civil rights when a state declares an emergency? What have you seen in the recent declarations of emergencies or stay-at-home, shelter-in-place? Excuse me, what have you seen in terms of its effect on people? Do you see any violations of some of the rights we discussed, even though nobody's challenging those violations because people are being cooperative?
Well, I would say, just the ordered closure of businesses is in and of itself. You have a right to, whether it be legal or a human right, a legal right to, own a business, to run it as you see fit, as long as you abide by, any licensing laws and all that kind of thing. So the fact that you're being ordered to close and abridge your ability to make a living, I would say is certainly does go into that arena of civil rights.
Sorry. There we go. Yeah. So, was there somebody else who was going to say something? I don't want to cut anybody off. No. So Shannon, that's a good point. You actually don't have the right to own a business or even make a living, believe it or not. It's not a right. But your freedom of movement is affected. And there is one institution that you I don't think you mentioned that is actually closing, which is attached to a right that somebody brought up in the first hour of the class. There are a certain set of institutions that are been ordered closed, not businesses, but that are affecting a large segment of the population's rights. Can you think of what that is?
Freedom of religion, to gather at a church.
So freedom of religion, you don't have a right to gather at a church. You have the right to practice your faith.
Okay.
You can practice your faith even if you're not in a church. Good guess though, Jason. The one I'm looking for is education. Okay, so you do have a right to get an education or have access to an education, and to not have the ability to get an education is a problem. So now most people are either homeschooling or remote schooling. We live in a time where people can get around that, but either at some place down the line that's going to hit a limit. Or if we lived 25 years ago or 30 years ago, most of us lived then, but if we were getting an education then and you didn't have remote access, this would be a much bigger civil rights issue. All that is to say, these are not, we're talking about them in the hypothetical, they're not going to become issues now, but as law enforcement officers who are looking at these issues, the longer this goes on, the longer the quarantines or the stay at home and the shelter in place orders stay in effect, which are kind of quarantine light, is what they are, the greater the civil rights issues will start to become. It's something that I'm looking at. So for instance, one of the issues I'm looking at is the ability of citizens to enter into the country. You have a civil right. In fact, that's one of the few rights that citizenship actually gets you, in addition to voting and things like that. You have a civil right to enter the country. What happens if you are stuck outside for some reason and you're unable to enter the country? Even let's say you couldn't book a ticket over the next week, or something happens, your flight gets delayed, or you get held over at another airport, and now you're forbidden from coming in. That's a civil rights issue with major implications for a lot of people. Okay. Another one is somebody seeking asylum or refugee access. They don't have the right to be in the country, but they do have the right to have their case be heard. They have a due process right. And what happens when that due process right goes away for tens of thousands of people? Okay. What happens when courts shut down and everybody's due process right starts going away? Some courts, I know federal courts in Washington, D.C. are operating remotely in some cases. So there's all of these civil rights issues that'll start coming up, which we will start having to deal with. That's going to be beyond the ambit of our class. I know a lot of you guys are busy working on things. Thanks for keeping us safe and working around the clock, even when everybody else is either working from home or not working.